Keep in mind that the sound of a snare drum, if it's a full drum kit, even if it's programmed, is always the combination between the close mic plus the overheads plus the rooms. Unless it's programmed in a way where you only have one snare sample and nothing in the overheads or rooms, it is always a combination of what comes through the overheads and the rooms and the close mics. Very important to keep in mind.
This is the Self-Recording Band Podcast, the show where we help you make exciting records on your own, wherever you are, DIY style. Let's go.
Hello and welcome to the Self-Recording Band Podcast. I'm your host, Benedict Hein. I'm a mixing engineer. My studio is called Outback Recordings, and we mix about 200 to 250, sometimes 300 songs per year. So we're working on a lot of music. Many of those songs are from self-recording bands, DIY artists, not all of them, but some. And we oftentimes coach people through the recording process, help them get better tracks at the source so that we can do a better job mixing. And naturally, we've been, coaching a lot of people through that process, and we have a lot of experience doing that. So that made us start this platform a couple years ago with the podcast, the coaching, and everything we do so that we can help you make better recordings in your jam space as well. So this is about improving the recordings, but also helping you get better mixes if you mix yourself. So usually I'm doing this with my friend and co-host Malcolm Owen Flood, but for these two episodes, last week and this week, I'm doing this by myself because I wanted to give you quick, actionable, short episodes, and Malcolm is away on a work trip, so this is me doing it a little differently this time. I hope you enjoy it. What we'll be talking specifically about is snare drum EQ today. So last week we talked about kick drum EQ. This week it's about snare drum EQ. So it's not one of those high-level, philosophical, big episodes that we often do. It's more actionable, precise, short, to the point. You can hopefully apply that immediately and let me know if it worked for you. Like I said last time, this is not something where there's like a one-size-fits-all solution. It's not that I'm giving you the way to EQ a kick drum. There's no such thing. There's no one way to EQ a kick drum or a snare drum. It always depends on the song, the genre, the context. So it's like how I approach EQing kicks and snares, and not so much a how-to because I don't really believe in that. But I think there is, at least to me, there is a general approach to it that can be applied across the board, not the precise settings, but the way to think about a snare drum or a kick drum, which can lead to better decisions, hopefully, and to a more intentional decision-making process when you EQ kick drums and snare drums. If you are new to the show, by the way, this is both an audio podcast and a video podcast, so it's primarily a podcast. So if you find this on YouTube, please know that you can listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you enjoy podcasts. If you want to watch this instead of listening, then you can go to YouTube, search for the Self-Recording Band, and you can watch all the episodes there. Now, to the topic of EQing a snare drum. Last week, and by the way, if you haven't seen that, please go back and watch that also. I think it's a great episode on kick drum EQ. Last week, I explained the different parts of the frequency spectrum that I have in mind when I think about kick drums. Now I'm going to be doing the same with the snare and then explain to you how you can shape these areas, these parts of the frequency spectrum. All right, let's start by going through it real quick, top to bottom, or bottom to top in this case. So to me, anything below 100 or so is not very important in snare drums. And I know people, again, this is something where some people will disagree. Yes, there sometimes can be a little bit of weight pressure down there, even on a snare drum. But it's not something where I typically would find a lot to boost or do anything with, really. I don't always cut it either, but below 100, not much going on that is worth boosting in most cases for me. So sometimes you can use a low cut and get rid of that stuff entirely. Sometimes you don't need that. If you do, be careful because it messes with the phase relationship with all the other mics of the drum kit and the overheads and all of that. So a low cut it always changes things. Sometimes it's better to not do it because you keep more of the punch and the impact together with the overheads. Sometimes the move is to use a low cut. Totally depends. Also, most low cuts will introduce a kind of a resonance at the frequency where the low cut sets in. So it can be both a cut and a slight boost because of that resonance. Just experiment with whether or not you want to use a low cut. Simple rule is if it sounds better, it is better. So try cutting and see if it works for you. So low cut is the first thing, or basically the stuff in the subs that is not so important for me in most cases. Doesn't mean you have to cut it always. The second aspect of the snare drum, the second part of it is like the body and the bottom end of the snare, which can be anywhere between usually 150 and 250, sometimes a little lower, sometimes a little higher. But for many snare drums, it lives around 150 to 250 hertz, 150 to 250 hertz is the body, the fundamental of the snare drum, depending on its tuning. As with the kick drum, I recommend using a frequency analyzer to not only hear it, but look at the frequencies and figure out where the biggest bumps are in this curve. And because these often tell you, oh, this might be the fundamental. Like if you look at it and somewhere around 200, you see a big bump that is higher up than all the rest of the frequencies that you see on the analyzer, then that is a good indicator that this might be your fundamental of the snare. So this is the body, the thickness, the fullness of the snare drum. Can be too much sometimes. Can sound tubby and like muddy. It can also sound too thin, and then you need more of that. But just know that this is where it lives. Around that, and usually slightly above that, are the harmonics. Like these are overtones of the snare drum that can be relatively close to the fundamental. They can be a little further away, but usually you'll find a couple of these above the fundamental. And sometimes if the snare is tuned nicely and in tune with itself and just nice, where the ring or the sound of the shell just sounds nice, you can leave those alone and it's fine. Sometimes there's an annoying ring in there that's just not musical or that is for whatever reason bothering you. Then you can find that, identify it, look at the analyzer again if you don't know where to look or what to listen for, and then narrowly turn it down, right? We get to the whole how to tweak things, but just know that there are overtones close to the fundamental that can be okay, but oftentimes can be annoying, muddy, dissonant, not really musical, and you might want to get rid of those. Then then also a little above the fundamental, around 300, 400 often, the snare can sound a little muddy and boxy, and it just opens things up and makes it sound brighter, more expensive if you cut a little bit there. Not always, but sometimes can be the case. It's just like a relief if you cut that and it immediately sounds a little more, there's more room, more air to breathe, basically. Then above that, around 700, 800-ish, sort of, the mid-range, oftentimes is the cheap sounding stuff, where depending on the genre, you might even want to boost that and bring out more of that ring or that little bit of a cardboardy, boxy, nasal characteristic of the snare. It can be cool for some genres. But oftentimes, if you clean that up and cut it in a broad way, it sounds a lot more expensive, a lot more polished. You get rid of the typical jam space sound that many snare drum recordings have. This oftentimes is around 700, 600, 800, somewhere there. 7 is a good starting point for me. And you just see what happens if you cut that in a relatively broad way. See what happens if it sounds more cleaned up, more expensive, more open, less cardboardy, less cheap, less like a jam space recording. Oftentimes it is around there. Then we have 1 kilohertz to 2 kilohertz, somewhere there. This is aggressive stick attack, oftentimes, where if you boost that, the snare comes forward. If you do too much, it can also sound a little weird and cheap sometimes, but it can also be the smack, the attack that you need. Not the clicky, thin type of attack, but the rim shot almost. Try it. It's a hard rim shot kind of attack that can make the snare sound a little more brutal and come forward in the mix a little more. So experiment with that. Then sometimes it can be too much if the snare is sounding too hard. You want it to be a little softer. You can also try cutting there. Then we have the upper mid-range, kind of 2 kilohertz to, let's say, 5 kilohertz. This can be very aggressive, very bright sounding, but in a really aggressive way. It can make the snare cut through. It can make the snare more present and open. If you do too much, it sounds very overprocessed and artificial and gets annoying quickly. It's almost like this, like a whip, a whip cracking sound, sort of, It can be a little too much really quickly. but it can also need a little bit of that to make the snare cut through a little more. But experiment with that. If you find the snare to be a little cheap there in terms of like overly processed in the upper mid range and a little like this weird, kind of sound, try cutting there around 3-4 kilohertz maybe. And if you need it to be more aggressive and brighter there, try boosting it. But I would go broad. I would not go narrow there because that gets annoying super quickly. You can narrowly cut an annoying resonance there, but boosting would be, for me at least, relatively broad. And then we have 6, 7, 8K. You could call it very upper mid range or like highs actually already presence. This is more of a detailed stick attack, less aggressive, very bright and open, but less aggressive than the 3K, 4K area. This is oftentimes the brightness that the snare drum needs. The red knob on an SSL channel strip, like I said with the kick drum, is really a thing that works the way it is really well. You could just leave it at 8K, the default setting, and just boost it, and then see if it works. Sometimes a shelf can be the move, sometimes a bell curve, but around 8K really opens up the snare, brings out the snare wires, brings out some detailed stick attack, makes it brighter without being like super harsh and weird. So oftentimes for me, that is the move to make snare drums brighter. I really very often go for like 8K and see if I can boost there and make it brighter. Then, and CLA would approve. This is like an online, ongoing joke about like how he boosts 8K everywhere, and especially his snare drums sometimes have like 10, 12, 15 dBs or more of 8K. You don't have to go that far, and especially not on every mix, but it is a good move for a lot of reasons often. Then we have the very top at like 10K plus, which can make the snare sound more open and airy, even more sizzle of the snares. Sometimes it's not really useful and sounds a little weird. Sometimes it can sound very expensive and nice. I have to play around with that. I rarely go that high. If I want some of that, I still go for 8K, but then switch to a shelf rather than a bell and see if I can just boost with a shelf, which includes everything above 10K as well. So now what and how and all that, and like when to do all these things. So the way I look at it is, if I need a very big sounding full kick drum with a lot of body, I will most likely boost the fundamental at around 200, wherever that is. Sometimes it's a cool move to boost below the fundamental, especially if you saturate and clip the snare a lot, or if you compress it a lot, because that can oftentimes put more emphasis on the fundamental anyways and its harmonics, and it can sometimes get too much around the fundamental. And if you instead go a little lower and boost slightly around the fundamental, the whole body area gets a little more broad, less pokey and narrow, and it makes the snare sound thick without having this very, very pokey, narrow spike at 200 or wherever. So sometimes I intentionally don't boost the exact fundamental, but slightly below or slightly above, usually below though. So the fundamental might be 200 and I might boost 150, for example. Make it a little thicker, but not by increasing the fundamental, but adding a little bit below that, more weight, and slightly addressing the fundamental as well. So there's that. Keep in mind that like I said with the kick, that the sound of a snare drum, if it's a full drum kit, even if it's programmed, is always the combination between the combination of the close mic plus the overheads plus the rooms. So unless it's programmed in a way where you only have one snare sample and nothing in the overheads or rooms, unless it's that, it is always a combination of what comes through the overheads and the rooms and the close mics. Very important to keep in mind. It doesn't matter what the snare sounds in solo, like the close mic. It matters what it sounds like as a whole. And in most rock and pop mixes, it's very important to also have the overheads and the rooms, because a close mic on its own will never sound like that massive, or whatever you want to call it, a polished snare drum sound that you want to hear on a record. And even if it's not, even if you're not going for modern, massive, and polished, it is still not just going to be the close mic. So the fundamental, though, is something that I like to get out of my close mics. Like, I really want to get that I want to capture that in the close mics, and not so much the overheads or the rooms, because it's just more direct, it's more powerful, punchy, and it brings the snare forward. So I often will cut that a little bit in the overheads or the rooms. I will use low cut or just filter out a little around the fundamental. Even I don't always low cut overheads, but sometimes I get rid of a little bit of the fundamental and get more of that from my close mic, because that moves the snare forward, and I get a more precise low end, not a washy kind of transient there. So that is something that I want to get out of my close mic a lot. Then the mid range, especially the lower mid range, needs some treatment in many cases for me with the snare. Like I said, there's narrow resonances oftentimes. And sometimes, if you, for example, have the fundamental at 200 and then at 250, there is a little thing that sounds weird, or 260, 230, whatever. Try and identify that, notch it out a little bit, and see if that if you have more focus on the actual fundamental now, if it sounds a little more open, a little more controlled, if an annoying dissonant resonance is gone away. So it's a little bit of ear training is necessary there, and analyzers really help you see this. But I would highly recommend experimenting with that and seeing and trying to see if you can clean up that a little bit. Sometimes, especially if the snare tuning is spot on, you don't need to do anything there, or you don't need to do a lot there. And I would not go and hunt for a dozen frequencies. I would, if there's something, it's usually one or two, and then I would leave it alone, because you can quickly kill the entire character of the snare drum by notching out all the resonances and harmonics. And that's not what you want. The harmonics are great, but sometimes there is one in there that is just not musical, and then you want to get rid of that. But stop after one or two. And if you really feel like you have to address 10 or 5 or whatever, it's probably just a very bad snare tuning, and you should use a different sample or a different recording. Tune it again and record again or whatever, right? So there's that. Then there is the more broad shaping of the lower mid-range, where oftentimes 300, 400 can sound a little muddy, boxy, and cleaning that up a little bit above the actual fundamental opens it up more, shifts the focus towards the fundamental more, makes it sound bigger, fatter, not as cheap. Sometimes nothing is needed, but play around with that. If you find it to be cardboardy and boxy, go for like 300, 400 and see if you clean it up there, if you can clean it up. Then the 1K area is where sometimes I need to cut that a little bit to make, let's not go to the 1K. Let's go to the 700 first, like 600, 700. This is, like I said, the cheap jam space kind of sound often. And very often I cut there in a very broad way. Sometimes if I want a more garagey, dirty kind of sound, I leave it alone. I rarely boost. That would be an extreme situation, or depending on the tuning, I guess. Sometimes there is a cool ring that I want to boost if it's a very specific character of the snare drum. But yeah, oftentimes sounds cheap, like a jam space thing. Not a cool kind of ring oftentimes, so I often get rid of that. Then keep in mind, again, the overheads in the rooms are important. So that whole mid-range thing, all the way from like 300 to 1 kilohertz, or even slightly above that, you can get a lot of that from the overheads and the rooms. You will get a lot of that from there. And so you don't have to have as much in the close mics often. So the close mics, to me, focus more on the fundamental and the stick attack and less on the mid-range, because I can get a lot of the mid-range in a very cool way and explosive and cool sounding way from my overheads and especially the rooms. And it's the blend of all these that makes it work. And if I leave it in all three of these, it can be too much very quickly, and it again sounds like a cheap basement recording. Then the 1K area is a hard type of attack to me that I sometimes boost if I want more this type of stick attack, sometimes cut if it sounds too hard and plasticky there. As always, see what works for you and for the specific song you're working on. Then the 2, and I would do that relatively broad either way. And then like the 2 to 5 kilohertz area, like I said, is this whip kind of sound that I need sometimes to make the snare cut through better. If it gets too much, it sounds very cheap oftentimes. Sometimes I need to cut that in the snare bottom and boost a little in the snare top, which can give more stick attack in the snare top, but less of the cheap whip kind of sound in the snare bottom. So you can cut that there and come and play around with the two and combine them in the way that you like. And then and the more aggressive the song is, the more you need there to make it cut through big guitars. But even with very heavy songs, if my guitar mid-range is okay and I don't have a ton of like really harsh, annoying 3-4K in guitars, I don't need a lot of that on the snare either. So if you find yourself needing a lot there on the snare because otherwise it just disappears and it's too dull, chances are your guitars are too harsh, and you might want to clean up the guitars a little bit, which automatically will help the snare come through there. So it's always a matter of context, and everything affects everything. And oftentimes the problem with your snare sound is not the snare itself, it's something else that is masking it. And then the real top end and brightness and presence and stick attack of the snare, to me, is in like 6K and above. Often around 8K is a great way to boost broadly. And really, like I said, an SSL channel strip, red knob at the top is usually around 8K. And you just leave it there, boost it, and then switch between shelf and bell and see what you prefer. Just boost as much as you want. That's all I do often in terms of brightness of the snare. So to sum it up, it's again, like with the kick drum, oftentimes a smiley face curve where I look for a cool spot in the low mids or like upper bass, whatever you want to call it, the fundamental of the snare or around there, and I boost there. And then I will find stuff I don't like in the mid range and I cut there. Can be very broad in general shaping, or it can be narrow resonances that I don't like. Then I will find cool stuff in the stick attack and boost. I might find narrow things I don't like there as well and cut. Sometimes it's a combination of narrow cuts of nasty resonances plus or like attack sounds that just are too annoying, plus a broad boost to brighten it up overall, and then a very bright boost at the top. So it looks like this, oftentimes smiley face, right? Bottom, scooped out mid-range, top. Yeah, that's how I think about it. And like I said, of course, again, context matters. I can't stress this enough. It totally depends on your genre, on your personal taste and style and all of that, but it is a great starting point in many cases. It often looks like that to some degree. It is a combination of overheads, rooms, and close mics. Very important to keep in mind. And also keep in mind that all the EQ changes you make affect the phase. And so you want to check against the overheads and the rooms always and see if things are still in phase. Very important. And if things are not in phase to begin with, all the stuff that I just mentioned won't matter because you won't hear an accurate representation anyway. So, for example, if your snare is out of phase with the overheads, there might be no bottom, and you can boost like a lot of 200 and still you'd have a thin snare, right? So you might want to flip the phase first and then see what happens. Or if the snare top and bottom are out of phase with each other, it's the same thing. You might drive yourself crazy figuring out why you can't make the snare sound big when you're just canceling out all the body because the two are out of phase. So that's very important. Go check out our episodes on phase as well and get that right first. So, okay, hope this helped you. Hope this was a quick, actionable episode that gives you results. And if so, please comment below if you want more of that, if you're watching on YouTube, or send us an email at podcast@theselfrecordingband.com. Let us know if you enjoyed that. If you did, please leave a review. This is very important. I said it last time. I need to say it more often. Please leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or both or wherever you enjoy podcasts, because this does a few things. First of all, it helps us reach more people like you so they can benefit from this podcast as well. And then the other thing is we've had amazing guests on the show already. If you go to our back catalog of more than 240 episodes now, you'll see phenomenal guests, Grammy winners, platinum winning, mixing engineers. Is platinum winning even a word? You know what I mean? Like platinum mixing engineers, award-winning, Grammy-winning mix engineers, cool engineers from all kinds of genres that you might have heard of, producers. Like, just look at our back catalog of episodes. You'll find amazing people there that you've heard of. And we get more of these people, and we get them more easily to come on the show if we have good reviews, because that shows that people are actually enjoying the show, and it's easier for us to approach these people. And we know a lot of these people personally, so that is what helped us so far to get them on here. But we also want to reach out to people we don't know yet, and it really helps if we have a lot of good reviews there. So if you want to see and hear these people on our show, please leave a review, and also share it with your friends if you think they would benefit from it. All right, thank you so much for listening. Let me know if this was helpful, if you can apply it to your mixes and recordings, because I think you can also think about recording and mic placement like that, and in general, like everything that affects the frequency response of the things you record. Let me know if that helped, and I really hope it did, and I see you next week. Thank you so much for listening. Bye-bye.